Keith Paints.
Hey folks, welcome back to Keith Paints. Today, I'm painting another Gunpla. I painted one in January, Char's Red Zaku, and enjoyed it so much that I had another model on hand for whenever felt right. And lo and behold, other YouTubers got the idea to mix their usual miniatures content with Gunpla. The rules are pretty open, just mix Gunpla into your normal content, so I was already set. I purchased this BUGU here because he has some pretty clear heraldry. Something I really like about some 40k models are the embossed heraldry of Space Marine Legions. I have already started sculpting and printing my own, testing the limits of my 3D printer in the process. In my Zaku video, I printed text so small I could barely read it, and could hardly work with it. For this one, I decided to switch it up some for easier use, but that comes at the end of the video. What you are watching now is me clipping out and preparing the parts for painting. This is just like any Warhammer prep. You clip out the pieces, then clean up any mold lines with a knife or sandpaper. I'm attaching them to coffee stir sticks for the purpose of spray painting. I won't have an airbrush for a while yet, so this is the quickest way to get good coverage. After some matte Rust-Oleum primer, I covered them in Macragge blue and brought them in for assembly. I learned with my Zaku that the paint job is pretty fragile at this point, in relation to all the moving parts, so I was pretty careful when putting it together. After some matte Rust-Oleum primer, I covered them in Macragge blue and brought them in for assembly. I learned with my Zaku that the paint job is pretty fragile at this point, in relation to all the moving parts, so I was pretty careful when putting it together. After touching up any spots that didn't get proper coverage with the spray paint, I moved on to shading. Shading makes a lot more sense with static models than posable ones, but some subtle shading will help the form of the model stand out a little. It's not so subtle looking here at first, but I will come back and blend them together a little later. I'm using Night Lord's blue, and just painting solid bands on surfaces that would face downward in a normal standing pose, as well as some other spots. Next, I do a pin wash with Drakenhof Nightshade. This is always one of my favorite steps in painting miniatures. Dropping a bit of wash into all the panel lines and creases really makes them pop out more. I perhaps should have done this before shading, so I could clean up after with one color, but it wasn't that big of a deal. Next, I do the same for highlights as I did for the shade. Here I'm using a mix of Calgar blue and Macragge blue to cover upward-facing surfaces, like the top of the shoulder pads and the head, as well as the tips of a couple parts like the bottoms of the skirt and over the feet. Now comes the fun part, blending. I'm not very good at glazing. It takes a lot of time and good paint control, so I'm working on wet blending using the loaded brush technique. This is where you fill your brush with one color and dip the tip in another, and blend the two together in one stroke of the brush. The first time I tried this was on my Zaku, and I felt it was pretty successful. This time, I pre-shaded and highlighted sections as you've already seen, and blended along the edges. It worked out really well, and I'm much more confident with the technique now. Soon, I'll apply it to my Space Marines. Next is another technique I attempted first on my Zaku, also quite successfully, and that is painting on battle damage. For this, I used Calgar Blue and painted lots of random, though often parallel lines across the model, but focusing on the edges. It kind of doubles as edge highlighting in that way. After I have a lot of lines, I come back with some Eshin Gray and put little bits in the middle of big scratches or where two intersect, to represent where the scratches peeled off some paint. I really like this technique and expect to use it on my Space Marines in the future as well. Alright, here's the thing that nobody else is doing. Instead of using decals, I model and 3D print the heraldry. This one is actually pretty simple. I decided to use just the word Xeon instead of attempting super tiny text again. That, the number 31, and the symbol of Xeon were pretty quick to sculpt. Forming them to the shape of the model is the tricky part. I took pictures of the model and approximated the shapes in Blender. Then, using two shrink wrap modifiers on two different vertex groups, I formed them to the shape of the model. For this to work properly, you have to remember to apply the scaling, which tripped me up for a minute. In the end, I kind of botched this part though. The curves were right, but somehow I got the sizing way off, and my first print ended up being about 1/3 of the size they needed to be. When I tripled their size, they were then way too thick, so I halved their widths and printed for a third time. They were still a little too big, but I wasn't printing again, and made do by spreading out across the shoulders and the skirt. To attach them, I used a bit of Storm Shield, a painted-on matte varnish, on the model, and pressed the bits into them, carefully positioning them and not waiting long enough for it to dry, so I had to fix it. Repeatedly. I could use super glue, but it makes a huge ugly mess. I could also do it before painting, but I felt that would interfere with my wet blending fun. Storm Shield does the trick, but you have to be careful not to use too much, or let it pool around the edges, especially if you have to do it 3 times because of impatience. It ended up leaving foggy bits here and there, which I fixed with tiny bits of Drakenhof Nightshade, then giving the whole thing a spray of matte varnish. In the end, I really like this model. I'm happy with the progression since the Zaku, and only think I would change one thing. I might try waiting until everything is done, and then doing the battle damage, after the final varnish. I think it might help them stick out more, something worth trying. Anyway, let's check in with other YouTubers. First one done seems to be Kevin, from Vivid Mini Mods. Big guitar, bigger sword, very highly detailed and heavily weathered. Awesome. Next up is James, from Rising Ape Miniatures. James painted some Tau battle armor in classic RX78 colors, and gave it a display base and a backdrop. Very nice. Yori, from Fox Hope Painting, gave theirs a base and a really nice camo paint job. Well done, especially since their first attempt melted under a dubious oil wash and they were forced to start over. And finally Liam, from Millenial model Mayem, and the organizer of this collaboration, has painted a really nice heavy arms with bright green edge highlighting, and also put it on a base. It looks great. Well, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed watching me build and paint this MS-04 BUGU. If you like 3D printing, check out my other channel, Tabletop Karnage, where I talk about what is available on Patreon and Kickstarter in that area. Link in the description. Thanks for watching everyone, and Sieg Xeon!